Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final seminar in the seminar series for the Gilbrea Centre. I won't say too much because we're all eager to hear what Carla Rice has to say to us. So we're pleased to welcome Dr. Carla Rice, Canada Research Chair and Professor from the University of Guelph. A number of you know her background, but she's worked in the field of body image embodiment studies. She was former director of the Canadian Initiative on Canadian National Eating Disorder Information Centre and the Body Image Project at Women's College Hospital in Toronto. So today she's speaking to us about Project Revision. And so we'll hear more about methodological possibilities of multimedia storytelling. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kind of you. And it's this is a great invitation, and I want to thank you for it. And it's great to see people are interested in multimedia storytelling. And the method that Revision uses. Revision itself is a funded research project, and we're really interested in investigating the power of the arts to advance social inclusion and justice and to positively impact decision makers in different sectors. So we have been working in healthcare as well as the education sector, moving into both profit and non-profit organizations as well as the arts sector. And we're with this method, and our approach, which I'm going to sketch out today, we want to support people in telling their preferred stories. So we work with communities, and we bring professional and studio-based arts into play with community arts. So that's one of the innovations of the project. We don't situate ourselves within professional arts context, but we hire and work with and have on staff videographers, professional photographers, and artists. And we bring artists together with activists, with people who work in institutions, and people who work in communities. So in our projects, we're blurring a whole lot of boundaries and trying to create a liminal space. So in what follows, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Revision and about our method. I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling in 3 acts. I'm going to talk about story as theory. I'll talk about story as identity and community, and I'll talk about story as interdependence or relationship. And I'm going to talk about story in these 3 ways, drawing on research projects, working with diverse communities, diverse and marginalized communities, working with urban indigenous people, working with Inuit, working with queer communities as well as disability communities. So we work with artists and activists and ordinary people from these communities in our projects. And we look at the power of the arts in these 3 ways. And we also investigate the potential of well-crafted and well-curated stories to have an impact, to spark systemic change. And so I'm going to end the discussion today by talking a little bit about the possibilities of storytelling. I'm going to talk about how I see these stories as impactful and pedagogical or educative, not in teaching people any one right way of thinking, feeling, or being, or acting in relationship to difference, broadly defined, but rather we're interested in sort of opening up possibilities for people's ways of being in relationship to difference. So as you can tell from what I've said so far, we're really interested in social justice issues, and we're working with communities around some of the most pressing issues, I think, of our time. And it's exciting work, and also it's challenging work because we're sort of working in these liminal spaces, at the edges of these, sort of different, kind of sectors, and bringing different groups of people together who may not be used to being in the same room together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as the talk unfolds today. And I'm going to introduce our multimedia storytelling work by sharing with you a few teasers, which were videos made from various projects. And the first teaser I'm going to show is from a CIHR-funded project called Mobilizing New Meanings of Difference and Disability. And this piece was made by Kirsty Lydiard. Kirsty is an academic. She identifies as a proud disabled woman. And she came into this project because she was really interested in the aims of the project, which were to dismantle stereotypic understandings of disability and difference that create barriers to healthcare for people living with disabilities. And in this video, Kirsty meditates on aspects of her bodily existence that many of us may share. So, just gonna let that kind of wash over you. And move into talking a little bit about the second film that I'm going to show. This one is called Interview with an Exotic Inuit. And it was made by a teacher called Marilyn Maybeck for a project called Nishnabek Dubwewin, or Telling Our Truths. And Nishnabek Dubwewin is a SHIRK Insight grant that is investigating how we can begin to decolonize our schools. And it's also looking at the complexities of accomplishing Indigenous education within the public school system. And the PI on this grant is Dr. Susan Dion. And we're working in collaboration with the Aboriginal Education Centre at the Farmer District School Board. And this is where we're. So, just let you feel that one for a few minutes. And I'm going to now introduce the third teaser, which is a piece from a Women's College Hospital Women's Health Exchange project, funded project that is a partnership project between the Sugar and Health Centre and a number of different universities. The focus of this project is working with queer women on speaking about conforming to, as well as resisting, idealized body images and expected body management practices. And the film that I'm going to show you is made by Carla Pendleton Jimenez, who is a writer and a professor. So, we situate our work both within activist art traditions over the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century in North America, and in particular feminist, Indigenous, and disability arts traditions. And on the one hand, and we also situate our work within critical arts-based research, the latter being a methodology that is focused on generating texts and artifacts as research, and is committed to political, process-oriented, postmodern perspectives. And the point of critical arts-based research as well is explicitly activist, and there's an explicit intention to make change through the art making, through the process of creating art, as well as through the showing of the art and sharing of the art. So at the heart of our approach at Revision is the coming together of storytelling and social change. Creating and sharing new understandings of difference that disrupt dominant narratives and open possibilities. And we take a multimedia narrative approach that's adapted from the Center for Digital Storytelling in Berkeley, California. And they actually developed their method through live theater monologues and through creating video out of live theater monologue, and also through radio first-person autobiographical documentary. So that's the sort of tradition that they're rooted in. We have drawn on their methodology and we've adapted it for our own purposes to make it into explicitly a research method. And while people use different terminologies, such as digital storytelling or ethno-cinema, also participatory filmmaking, to talk about first-person or community-based storytelling using video and photography, sort of as a research method. We like to use the term, kind of settled on the term, multimedia storytelling, because we think it opens the method explicitly to diverse media forms, and also because it places the emphasis on story and the constructivist nature of all storytelling and all accounts of sort of reality. I mean, we can think about any knowledge claim at its core as a story. So sort of we stretch the idea of story to sort of its broadest possible sort of way of being conceptualized. We can think about knowledge claims as stories about the nature of existence, the nature of our world, the nature of our physical world, metaphysical, etc. So we accomplish this work where we sort of blur these boundaries and experiment with arts-based methods at the University of Guelph, where we've got a lab called the Revisioning Differences Media Arts Lab. It's a physical space where we do media production and post-production, but we also have a mobile media lab where we create work with communities. And the images that you see here on this loop are images from various workshops from the different projects that I've already talked about. So in the past 5 years, we've run dozens of projects. Projects involving people with disabilities and healthcare providers, again on changing conceptualizations of disability and difference with urban Indigenous people, teachers, students, parents, and allies on trying to decolonize public schools, with queer communities speaking back to obesity epidemic discourse and eating disorder discourses that either on the one hand invisibilize or on the other hand pathologize queer bodies within those discourses. And also most recently we've been working with Inuit people, Inuit artists and youth on building Inuit cultural voice. So the workshops enable participants to create multimedia stories. This is two Inuit artists, Ruben and Kuzi, standing in front of CAMH. It's quite funny, they're very, very funny guys. Multimedia stories in our collection tend to be between 1 and 5 minutes long. Stories that pair either personal narratives or cultural narratives with visuals, and those visuals can be artwork, it can be photography or film. To date, we've generated an archive of over 250 stories that have been shown locally, nationally, and internationally. So these stories have traveled. The images that you're going to see are images from an art exhibition that featured stories from the Indigenous collection in the James B. Aird Gallery. And this gallery is a gallery that is actually on the main floor of the McDonald block in the Ontario Legislature at Queen's Park. So what was unique about this art exhibition is that it brought together community stories with the work of emerging and established Indigenous artists. And what this did was it created a space in the gallery where artists, where people from the community, and where policymakers and decision makers could meet, because actually this gallery is in the same building that also houses the Ministry of Education. And so the show was able to attract senior policymakers from the Ministry of Education who actually went on to work closely with Susan Dion, who's the PI on this grant, on developing policy and investigating how to begin to decolonize public schools in Ontario, and how do we understand Indigenous education, and how might Indigenous education be practiced in schools across Ontario. The Indigenous stories have also traveled to be shown to trustees and the Director of Education at the Toronto District School Board, and they've also been shown to trustees and directors of education boards across the province, among many other places. The disability collection, the disability films, and these are two facilitators from the disability work, Eliza Chandler and Jess Sash. The disability work has actually, it's been shown to equity leads in hospitals across the GTA. The work has also been shown to boards of directors and CEOs of the teaching hospitals in Toronto. They've been screened for grand rounds in a number of hospitals, and we have been invited to, as a result of some of this, sort of work to consult with the equity leads on how to achieve health equity in sort of the Toronto area, in healthcare, and how to move from understanding disability as a biomedical problem to seeing disability as a social and cultural identity, which is a huge move for that to happen within healthcare, because healthcare is a primary site where people are still work with a very biomedical model of disability. The work that was created through revision also caught the eye of the Ontario Arts Council and an arts organization called Tangled Arts Plus Disability, and which is a leading disability arts organization in Ontario that works to cultivate disability arts. We collaborated with them on a project, and this led to Eliza Chandler getting the artistic directorship of Tangled Arts Plus Disability, in large part due to her talents, which were made visible through her work on revision. So that just gives you a little overview of how and where the stories have traveled and how they've had an impact on decision makers, on policy, and sort of also on practice. Sort of those two collections in particular. Now, while many folks have used sort of arts-based research, have used digital storytelling in particular as an arts-based research method, and also as a knowledge dissemination tool, I think there are a few things that possibly make the work that we do a bit unique. And the first one is that we work to blur boundaries between us and them by working with aggrieved communities and allies who are work in systems that are implicated in people's oppression. So obviously these are not mutually exclusive groups. People with disability work in healthcare system, Indigenous people work in the education system. What we're interested in doing is bringing people together who are differently positioned inside and outside of these systems to create provisional communities and places of strength from which people can begin to do the difficult work of making systemic change. And sort of we invite people who are not members of the, whatever the aggrieved group is, to also engage in a process of constant self-reflexivity. So people are thinking about their relationality to the issues. We also understand and recognize that embedded as we all are in hegemonic cultural narratives and values, and as saturated as many of us are by social media and in social media, telling our stories is simply not enough. Right? We have to be thinking critically about stories. We have to be thinking about the effects of the stories that we tell. So in order to push against dominant narratives and dominant representations and framings, we need to, and we do, create a new curriculum that becomes a kind of framework for each project. And that curriculum might be one that kind of investigates what are some of the dominant narratives around this issue. What are we trying to push against in this project? And we work with artists and activists in order to develop that curriculum. Sort of within sort of the Queer Women's project, we thought a lot about, okay, what are the dominant stories that are told from within biomedicine? within obesity science about queer bodies, about queer women's bodies, about queer racialized women's bodies, about queer Indigenous women's bodies, and what kind of stories do we want to tell to begin to push against some of that and to break through some of that. We thought the same when we thought about eating disorders in relationship to queer bodies, thinking about what are the dominant narratives around eating disorders both within the culture as well as within sort of the mainstream conventional literature, and how can we push against some of those. We also build workshops led by members of marginalized groups, and so people take up positions of facilitators and holding the workshops together. We bring in artists from those groups and also videographers and technical experts, so that we build a team who are embedded deeply in communities and understand some of the big issues that communities are facing, to temporarily shift power dynamics, so that when we bring some majority group, sort of privileged, unmarked storytellers into the space, then there's also some accountability. So we really also emphasize accountability in our processes, so that people are thinking about the stories they tell and the implications of those stories. And so as you can tell from this, we bring professional and studio-based arts into play with community and participatory arts. We know that's kind of a dangerous thing to do, especially in the area of disability, where art and disability arts has been seen as kind of therapeutic, and disability-identified artists haven't been acknowledged as professionals, or as sort of people for whom art is sort of their life's calling and their work. But we do it because we want to sort of challenge some of the elitism that exists in the art world, and we also want to increase the sort of quality and hence the impact of the stories that we create. And I can tell you that in the Invisibility Indigenous in the City art exhibition, people came into the gallery who had never been in a gallery space before. And sort of some of the photographs that you saw on that group were photographs of senior policy advisors or the Deputy Minister of Education sitting next to an Indigenous group. So it was a space where people actually came together, in part because it wasn't only high art. So there was also participatory community arts in the space. So that was one of the sort of things that brought a broader audience into the space. So I now want to move to talk a little bit about storytelling itself as theory, as identity, and as a relationship. I've been a big fan of stories for a long time. In a previous life, I was a clinician at Mobilizing hospital, where I worked with people's stories of distress, vulnerability, struggle. And I also, sort of helped them, and, sort of their kin, not only to affirm those stories, but in some cases to rewrite those stories. So I worked explicitly with a method of therapy called narrative therapy, which is rooted in Foucauldian ideas and Derridian kind of ideas. And then I went on to write and do my PhD and collect my PhD research. And my PhD examined the entanglement of a rich sampling of women's body stories with larger cultural narratives told about their bodies. So despite working with stories for probably 20 years plus, I still have a lot of trouble in theorizing stories and figuring out how to theorize them. And I think that I have Cherokee writer Thomas King to blame for this, because he's the one who tells us that the truth about stories is that that is all we are. So if that's the case, where do we start? If stories are sort of the way that we make sense of ourselves and others and the world around us, how do we begin to even think about them theoretically? Well, following Indigenous traditions, King views stories not solely as entertainment, but as carriers of people's knowledge, values, and beliefs, as speech acts that have the power to make and to change the world. I start with King because some scholars interested in stories storytelling as research method, frame storytelling and frame this approach to research as relatively new, as emerging from post-structuralism generally, or as emerging from the kind of cultural turn in the social sciences, where social scientists turn to, especially critical social scientists, turn to narrative theory and to literary studies as a way of making sense of the challenges of post-structuralism and postmodernism, not taking lived experience as truth, but sort of beginning to think about lived experience as sort of another version of reality, a constructed story about reality. So people, sort of from within, sort of the social sciences, especially critical social sciences, sort of root some of their turn, the cultural turn in these, sort of theoretical traditions. But I think what remains unacknowledged here is that Indigenous peoples have for centuries understood story as theory, as engaging people's worldviews and conveying their deepest beliefs about themselves and about the world around them. So building on this understanding of story, King goes on to talk about stories, to remind us that stories are wondrous things and very dangerous. What does he mean by stories being dangerous? Novelist Chimamanda Adichie also writes and speaks about the dangers, or the wonders and the perils of stories. And she talks in particular about the dangers of the single story, what she calls the single story, or the story that's told repeatedly about an individual or group, told so often that it becomes the main way that that individual or group is framed. And this quote, probably a lot of people know this quote, it comes from her TED Talk. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but rather that they are incomplete. They make the one story the only story. So at Revision, we're kind of interested really in interrogating kind of two intriguing and pressing questions that I think emerge from this problematic of stories both being illuminating as well as being sort of dangerous and stereotype creating. We're interested in how we can move past the dominant narrative or single story without producing a single counter story that similarly entraps us or ensnares us. And how we can, secondly, listen to each other and reflect deeply on the implications of the stories we tell. So I think that these writers teach us that stories are the things that bring us together, they define us, they tell us about the world around us. Yet stories are also the things that break us apart, that make us invest in ways of being in the world that are destructive to each other and destructive to the planet. So I'm going to show you now a couple of things, a couple of pieces that I think reflect on some of the theory that stories do, some of the theory work that stories do. How they teach us to think, and the real material effects that stories have in our lives. The first film that I'm going to show is made by Hildy Zitzelsberger, and Hildy is a nursing professor. She made a film called My Impossible Invulnerability. And in it, she contemplates how we all occupy many positions in our lives, both privileged and marginalized. But how claiming a marginalized position or identification can ensnare us or trap us into a confined space that's not of our own choosing. She asks us to question how we might tell and hear vulnerable stories in ways that don't collapse others or ourselves into categories of otherness or oversimplify how we love, how we work, and how we walk in the world as both insecure and self-assured, as both broken and Inuit. The second piece, called Words, is made by Indigenous artist Vanessa Dion Fletcher. She is Lenape and Potawatomi, and she also happens to be my daughter-in-law. Vanessa, in this film, is writing of defining encounters with the formal education system, a system that frames her as sufficient and lacking. using homophones to juxtapose her first-person experiences of perceived learning disabilities with the objectifying language of diagnostic tests and psychological reports. She wrestles words from the tyranny of formal education, her differential spellings becoming an act of reclamation and an artful opening to alternative modes of meaning.
Stories make us ask questions about who we are and who we should be, make us take risks and go to vulnerable places. Going to vulnerable places opens us to wounding and attack. Vulnerability is seen as, and the vulnerable self is seen as something we should hide in this neoliberal world that values autonomous, independent, sort of heroic selfhood, I guess, in many ways. But it also opens us to caring and understanding, and to the possibility of belonging, to the possibility of community, and to the possibility of social life generally. I'd like to tell you a brief story about the power of vulnerability in collaborative storytelling. I got the idea for Revision in 2007 after participating in my first digital storytelling workshop, which was with women living with disabilities and differences for a grant upon which I was PI. At the time, I was also writing a paper on the importance of self-reflexivity in research. And so I knew that if I was asking participants to go to vulnerable places, I had to go to my own. And the story I made, which was called Elephant in the Room, was a story that could only have been made with a community of women who lived with bodily difference. And being in that community and in that collaborative space enabled me to come out, so to speak, and tell a story about my bodily difference, and really account for myself, and in a kind of deep way around what my relationality to my research was. So, although I see my story and all the stories created through Revision as authentic representations of selves and of cultures and communities as a certain point in time, I no longer am the person I was when I made it. My views have shifted around certain things, developed new ideas. My body has changed. This was 2007, almost 10 years ago. This highlights for me the layered meanings of the word revision itself. And in this project, I borrowed the word revision from the work of, from an essay in particular that was written by the feminist poet Inuit, who in a 1972 essay talked about and reflected on the meaning of the word revision. She describes it thus: revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction for women, is more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. Until we can understand the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves. Now, while one can take Rich's interpretation to mean uncovering an authentic truth hidden behind false assumption, a version that equates vision with truth, the idea that seeing is believing, which is ubiquitous in our society, but which we also know is faulty, it is also possible to glean another meaning. Rather than fixing or correcting past falsehoods to uncover a hidden truth, revision can also be understood as a continuous process of revisiting, rethinking, and reworking, of understanding and approaching the self and the individual self, the communal self, as a continuous process of revising, changing, and becoming. So I'm going to share with you a story that grapples with themes of identity, subjectivity, and community. It's called Winter, and it was made by Geronimo Inuit, who is an Inuit artist who works with music. And it uses language to tell of hybrid identities. Geronimo sings and speaks himself in Inuit, in French, and in English. In his intimate encounter with a homeless Indigenous man living on the streets, Geronimo gives us a glimpse of post-contact history from the vantage point of those bonded and bounded through and against the multi-layered brutalities of colonialism.
This brings me to the third act of storytelling, which is relationship. While many discussions of storytelling for social change focus on telling your story, the importance of talking back to dominant discourses or narratives, making space for the tellings of stories, what we find equally important in this work is that it's important to listen. We also emphasize within the workshop context and post-workshop when we're showing stories on the necessity of listening. So the process creates space not only for shared creativity, but also for mutual accountability. This is the reason why our workshops feature presentations on representation that encourage storytellers to think critically about the stories that they tell. While the focus is on individuals telling their stories, crafting stories in a group context emphasizes our interdependence with each other. The collaborative dimension of all storytelling, whether that the listener is imagined or the listener is sitting in front of you. So rather than a do-it-yourself approach, group process makes plain the interconnected, collaborative enterprise of story making and sharing. Now, I have a few more stories to show, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to end by posing a question, which is, what are the pedagogical possibilities of this work? Since beginning, sort of setting up this lab and working with various communities, I've become interested in how art and how story teach without being didactic or telling people what to think or feel. I'm interested in how art and story makes people think, moving and affecting audiences to indeterminate ends. And in this, I'm influenced by Elizabeth Rose, the philosopher, who draws on the work of Gilbrea Centre and reflects on the power of art to disrupt our thought-level reactions and provoke new visceral responses to things. And Rose writes, art is not frivolous, an indulgence or luxury, an embellishment of what is most central. It is the most vital and direct form of impact on and through the body. It's a generation of vibratory waves, rhythms that traverse the body and make of the body a link with forces it cannot otherwise perceive and act upon. Here she suggests that art may operate at a different register than science or philosophy by opening up emergent, unpredictable alternatives for knowing and for knowing difference. Thinking with Rose, revision stories may function as becoming pedagogies that offer non-didactic and indeterminate possibilities for living in, with, and across difference. While necessarily non-didactic, the stories are still instructive and productive insofar as they produce new possibilities for living. By conducting and reflecting on this work, I hope to make space for methodologies that expand openings for creativity and community, for facilitating the becoming of such activities and the becoming together of communities. The end.